Hello, everybody. My name is Madison Kearney, and this is my anti-diet presentation. So, Chapter 1. This chapter was called The Roots of Diet Culture. This entire chapter essentially highlights the different types of body shapes that were accepted and the different types of diets that were formed during each time period. For example, during the ancient Greek and Roman time period, diets did not exist. Being larger and heavier was a sign of prosperity and a sign of wealth. Being thin was a sign of poverty and weakness. People saw a heavier body as beautiful. Majority of the reason being it was because it signified wealth. Women wanted to be seen with folds of skin on their sides and a larger stomach region. Mothers often overfed their daughters and force-fed them so that they could achieve this look. That being said, the book stated that about 81% of societies favored heavier and larger women, although some people had the idea that being fat was a disease. So this idea came up around the ancient Greek times and eventually was shortly forgotten about after the falling of Rome. I wanted to include these pictures because this is what some of the ancient Greek statues looked like, and you can see that the women were heavier and more curvier versus today's generation of being very thin. The chapter then shifted time periods and started explaining the drastic changes that occurred during the American Industrial Revolution. Now that textile industries and factories took over the US, the shape of humans also changed. Factories and clothing businesses started making clothes to fit a specific template. The templates consisted of small, medium, and large. That being said, people began to start fat shaming since their clothes were now put into categories. People were able to compare their sizes to one another, which then led to different types of diets being created. Shortly after the American Revolution, a man named Sylvester Graham began to tell people that alcohol, meat, caffeine, and condiments were bad for their bodies, that they should no longer consume them. He was fixated on the idea that if people indulged in these items, that they would get ill. He also introduced the idea of weighing oneself. Not only was the idea of weighing oneself introduced during the time period categorizing people on a hierarchy system, people associated people of color to be larger and white people to be thinner. This introduced the idea of modern-day diets to individuals. Men who were heavier were seen to be less masculine. Therefore, they began to diet so they could be seen as more masculine. This chapter then discussed how a drawing of an hourglass woman that was nearly impossible to achieve was published. This drawing consisted of a woman with a very thin waist. That being said, this became the new body image of women. If a person did not look like this drawing, they were deemed ugly, and this drawing was named the Gibson Girl. Women were often not consuming enough food in order to achieve the look of the Gibson Girl. In addition, women also reduced their intake of food in order to fit into the flapper girl era. This picture on the right is a picture of Mr. Graham. And then I wanted to incorporate two pictures of what the workshops of the American Industrial Revolution look like. And then I mentioned earlier about the Gibson Girl. She had the hourglass figure with the nearly impossible waist to achieve. And this girl essentially became the new icon, and everybody wanted to look like her, but it wasn't possible to achieve that look. So then the flapper girl came about, which was more, I would say it was easier to achieve the look. Not easier, but it was more possible. So girls started reducing how much food they would eat so they can fit into the skin-tight flapper girl dresses. As we learned earlier in this chapter, doctors always thought that gaining weight was a part of life and symbolized wealth. Therefore, they weren't against people gaining weight, and they didn't want people to reduce their food intake. Although, during the 1900s, doctors' views on weight gain took a turn when society became so focused on being thin. There was no actual proof that losing weight was healthy. Doctors just became biased and leaned towards society's belief. The medical field introduced harsh diets and pills to help people lose weight. They also introduced weight loss surgeries to individuals in need, but only certain types of individuals could actually have these surgeries because you had to be categorized in a certain category of obesity. People were also being measured with a few new systems called the BMI. And this system was created to categorize different levels of fat. And I wanted to include a couple pictures. So this bottom right picture is the body mass index. And as you can see on the bottom, it has different categories, with the middle one being normal. And it goes from underweight to being overweight. And then this shows different types of diets. And this is a penny scale, so people often weighed themselves. And then those were the weight loss pills that were introduced, and that was their advertisement back in the day. Now that BMIs and scales have been introduced to the world, individuals have become obese with the fact that they just weren't losing weight. A few new weight loss programs were introduced, such as Weight Watchers, and Weight Watchers was created to help Americans lose weight quickly, although this program did not work effectively for all Americans. Thus, some individual came up with the idea that they were just overeating because they couldn't control their emotions. When people became stressed, they would essentially eat until they felt better, which caused people to gain weight. During the same time period, a famous British model struck the media. She was nicknamed Twig because of how thin she was. This then began the idea of having a very thin body type in society and in the model industry. If you did not have a thin body type, you were no longer deemed beautiful. In order to fulfill this idea that being thin is beautiful, the government endorsed a dietary goal for the United States. In order to achieve this goal, the low-fat diet was created, and it struck communities within the US during 1977. So this was the British model, nicknamed Twig. And as you can tell, she's very thin and very lean. So women wanted to essentially look like her. And then that was the old Weight Watchers logo when they first were created. And this was the low-fat diet that the government had created for individuals. Basically, you just had to eat fruits, vegetables, and consume lower levels of dairy. Now that we have a bunch of different types of weight loss programs and new diets introduced to the world, ironically, the obesity epidemic began shortly after. The obesity epidemic began in 1998. People began to excessively diet, which then, over time, turned into them gaining weight instead of losing weight. Now that the population is shown to be gaining weight, the National Institutions of Health decided to update the BMI scale. They changed the categories by adding more forms of being fat. So they essentially created more categories showing that there are different levels of fatness and that people were gaining more weight. So a lot of people ended up in like the heaviest category. This brought great distraught within the US. On top of that, a man named William Dietz created a map showing the obesity levels within each state, which then struck a rise in the amount of obesity articles being published around the US. So this was the updated version of the BMI. And as you can see here, they added more classes of obesity, whereas before it was just normal, thin, and overweight. And so they did add more levels of thinness, but that wasn't very common back then. And then this was an example of one of the articles that was published on the left. And the map above was created by William Dietz, and it essentially it deemed each state and what category of weight they were in. So like, for example, let's say the color yellow is very thin, so this state would have a population of very thin people. And let's say purple is like obese people. So all those states would be labeled as obese. Moving on to chapter 2. Chapter 2 dives into the aspects of diets and determining if a diet is actually good for a person. A study was done in 2008 to determine that being fat was not a bad thing, although the study struck its researchers rather hard. One of the researchers in charge of the study, Liz, had never been on a diet in her life until she conducted this study. All of the obesity epidemic articles made her get into her head and question her weight. Therefore, was the obesity epidemic real, or is it just a mind game to get people to lose weight in the US? To add on to this idea, food activists created an article called Fast Food Nation. This was one of the largest and well-known articles that was published by a food activist. It essentially went over the fact that fast food is making obesity rates higher. Sadly, the publishing of this article led to many other articles and books to be published on what foods to avoid and what foods are acceptable to consume, thus increasing the idea of dieting even further. One form of dieting was created by reducing the intake of gluten in one's diet. This form of dieting was discovered when a doctor in Italy studied the disease we call celiac disease. Celiac disease is an intolerance to gluten. People who have this disease are incapable of digesting gluten. Another diet that was created during this time to help people avoid consuming gluten was the clean eating diet. This diet consisted of eating organic and so-called clean foods that were not processed. This idea came about in the early 2000s. To further the idea of eating clean, people came up with terms such as being vegan and vegetarian. The term vegan came about when people only eat fruits and vegetables, and they stay away from any form of animal food. And vegetarian is just fruits, veggies, and no meat. So you can still have dairy and eggs and everything, but you can't have any meat. And then I wanted to include a couple graphics that explain the diets that I just mentioned. So this bottom left picture shows an example of what people determined the clean eating diet as. And then this was the book that was published, or the article Fast Food Nation, that essentially took down the US population. It essentially called out everybody that was consuming fast food. And it said that people who are eating fast food are gaining weight just because it's more accessible and easier. And then these two graphics on the right are just forms of vegetarian and vegan diets. Now that the chapter has discussed different forms of diet, such as vegan, gluten-free, the clean eating diet, and vegetarian, there is a rise of health issues that followed. One of the largest health issues that occurred when it came to dieting was anorexia. The first case was discovered when a physician named Stephen Bratman tried to tell his patients to eliminate certain types of food to help with various health conditions such as eczema or asthma. His patients became obsessed with this form of dieting that they eventually barely ate food, which caused them to become malnourished. These new diagnoses soon struck social media when certain individuals came out about their eating disorders. People began their own versions of diets by eliminating foods, thus leading them to be diagnosed with anorexia. The book emphasizes the effects of not eating enough food and then discusses how the world reacts to this issue. The world changes their ideas of dieting and turns it into a form of being healthy and well. Dieting no longer exists. It's just a lifestyle of maintaining health. If one eats healthy, they will be healthy and avoid medical issues. And that's what people would say as the wellness diet. So basically you eat healthy foods and you won't have any problems. And this was an example of food as medicine when the doctor tried to tell people to avoid certain foods because certain foods affect certain body parts, but I wanted to incorporate an image that showed like foods that help your body. And this is an example of anorexia. Moving on to chapter 3. Chapter 3 mainly focuses on how dieting is not everything it turns out to be. A man named Albert Stunkard gathered a study together that analyzed if diets really did work. His findings showed that half of these studies done on various diets did not have accurate results, which is odd. They would not contain all of the participants' results. These results would also be collective rather than individual. So if there's a study done on weight loss, they would only include the final total and not the individual. Like, let's say if somebody participated and they lost 10 pounds and someone lost 2 pounds, they would just say that this study was done and 12 pounds was lost. So he concluded that majority of diets did not work for everybody. In addition, diets often do not work for individuals because they do not take their time out of their day and they do not do it properly. This chapter discussed how dieting takes certain diets require exercising, which takes up more time. And then diets also require certain foods to be consumed, which then leads to frequent trips to grocery stores, which also eliminates more time. And like, as I said earlier, working out also takes more time and people don't always have that time in the day. There are also so many types of diets that people try and they end up switching because it didn't work for them. So then that also wasted their time for committing so much effort into one diet for not seeing any results. This chapter also discusses how diets over time make people gain more weight at the end of the day. People see changes in the beginning and then they eventually do not follow the diet as strictly as they should, or they binge eat on their days off. Like some diets have cheat days and people take the cheat days too far. So they eliminate any progress that was made. And not only do people not follow diets properly, they're making their bodies used to limiting food intake and only eating certain types of food. Therefore, they damage their fullness receptors and hunger sensors. Sadly, this happens to the majority of people who participate in different types of diets. They're constantly changing how their body reacts, and eventually their body isn't able to react as fast anymore. But there are a slight few people who are not affected and actually do see results from their diet. The diet that hurts people the most, according to this chapter, is the wellness diet. It essentially focuses on eliminating food to avoid certain skin issues and small medical issues, and it's basically like an anti-inflammatory diet. Thus, it will lead to more medical issues at the end of the day because you're eliminating foods that you think are affecting you. Like, if I don't eat blueberries, I won't have red skin. So it's like little like silly connections between foods. And then I wanted to incorporate this image showing that the brain affects the stomach. So like I said, that the fullness receptors and the sensor receptors and sensors are damaged because when you don't eat as much, your stomach shrinks and then you get full faster. So your brain receptors connect all the way to your stomach and it acknowledges that you're not as hungry anymore because your stomach shrank. And then this is a graph showing diets that were like specific diets that people participated in. And it essentially just shows how like up and down people like gain weight, lose weight, stay steady. And it's just like not effective. So yeah, and then this is my discussion question. Does taking part in different types of diets make an individual more likely to face weight stigma, even if the diet is working? If so, why?